March 15, 1841. Magnolia Grove Plantation, just outside Natchez, Mississippi. The moon hung heavy over the cotton fields, casting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets the daylight refused to tell. Inside the overseer's cottage, 3 women stood around a wooden tub filled with scalding water. Their names were Ruby, Celia, and Temperance. Sisters not by blood, but by something deeper. Something forged in fire, shaped by suffering, and tempered by a love so fierce it would make them do the unthinkable. Can you imagine loving someone so much that you would risk everything, even your own life, to protect them? Tonight, these 3 women would prove that love doesn't just move mountains. Sometimes it drowns devils. What they were about to do would send shockwaves through the entire South. The newspapers would call it madness. The courts would call it murder. But history would remember it as justice served by hands that had known nothing but cruelty. This is the story of how 3 enslaved women took their tormentor's final breath and watched it bubble up through bathwater mixed with blood and vengeance. Before we dive deeper into this tale of sisterhood and rebellion, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you believe love can drive people to commit acts they never thought possible. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because stories like these need to be told. The air inside Magnolia Grove was always thick with something more than humidity. It carried the weight of whispered prayers, stifled screams, and dreams deferred until they rotted like fruit left too long in the Mississippi sun. The plantation stretched across 800 acres of black earth, rich with cotton and soaked in tears that no amount of rain could wash away. Margaret Whitfield ruled this empire of suffering like a queen of thorns. She was 34 years old, pale as bone china, with eyes the color of winter sky. Cold, calculating, beautiful in the way that sharp things are beautiful. Dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. She had inherited Magnolia Grove from her father, along with his particular brand of cruelty, but she had refined it, perfected it, turned it into an art form. Would you believe that someone could smile while ordering a whipping? Margaret could. She would sit on her veranda, sipping mint juleps and watching punishment unfold like it was theatre performed for her amusement. But her real expertise wasn't in public displays of power. No. Margaret's true genius lay in the visible scars. She had H's that left no private moments, the quiet tall way of studying people, learning their weaknesses, finding the exact spot where pressure would cause the most pain. And nowhere was this skill more evident than in how she treated the 3 women who worked closest to her. Ruby, Celia, and Temperance. The house servants who knew her secrets, who saw her without the mask she wore for society. Ruby was the eldest at 28, tall and graceful, with skin like polished mahogany. She had been born on the plantation, raised in the shadow of the big house, trained from childhood to anticipate Margaret's every need. Her hands were artist's hands, delicate and precise, perfect for arranging flowers, pressing linens, and absorbing the sting of Margaret's riding crop when perfection wasn't quite perfect enough. Celia came next, 25 years old, with fierce eyes and shoulders that had learned to carry more than their share. She had arrived at Magnolia Grove 5 years earlier, sold away from a tobacco farm in Virginia, where she had left behind 2 children she would never see again. Margaret knew this, of course. She made sure to remind Celia of it whenever the woman's spirit seemed too strong, whenever her back straightened with too much pride. And then there was Temperance, the youngest at 22, honey-coloured skin, and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. She had been Margaret's personal maid since she was 16, brushing her hair, lacing her corsets, listening to her secrets and her lies. Temperance knew which of Margaret's smiles meant pleasure and which meant pain. She had learned to read the signs like a sailor reads the sky before a storm. Can you imagine being trapped in a house with someone who held your life in their hands like a toy they could break at any moment? These 3 women lived that reality every single day. They woke before dawn to serve breakfast. They worked until after midnight to prepare for the next day. And in between, they endured Margaret's particular brand of psychological warfare. You see, Margaret understood something that many slave owners didn't. Physical pain heals, wounds close, bruises fade, broken bones mend. But emotional wounds, those fester. They grow infected with shame and hopelessness until they poison everything they touch. Margaret was a master surgeon of the soul, cutting deep and precise. leaving scars that would never fully heal. She would make Ruby arrange elaborate dinner parties, then criticize every detail in front of the guests. The flowers were wrong. The silverware wasn't polished enough. The timing was off. Small things, perhaps, but delivered with such venom that Ruby would retreat to the kitchen afterward, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. With Celia, Margaret's cruelty took a different form. She would speak casually of the children's market in New Orleans, describing in vivid detail how young ones were examined, priced, sold. She would wonder aloud whether Celia's children had found good homes, whether they remembered their mother, whether they cried for her at night. Celia would stand perfectly still during these monologues, face like stone, but her hands would tremble. And Temperance? Margaret saved her most creative torments for the girl who knew her best. She would force Temperance to watch as she destroyed things the young woman treasured: a pressed flower from her mother's grave, a wooden carving made by a boy who had once shown her kindness. Margaret would hold these precious items over a candle flame, watching Temperance's face as they burned, feeding on the girl's silent anguish. Think about the people you love most in this world, your family, your closest friends. Now imagine watching them suffer, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. That helplessness, that rage with nowhere to go. That's what these three women carried every day. But here's what Margaret didn't understand about love, about the bonds forged in shared suffering. Love doesn't just endure. Sometimes, love fights back. It started with small things. A look exchanged across the dining room when Margaret wasn't watching. A gentle touch on the shoulder when one of them was struggling not to cry. Whispered words of comfort shared in the brief moments when they were alone together. Ruby, Celia, and Temperance began to see themselves not as individual victims, but as a family united against a common enemy. They developed their own language, subtle as shadows, a certain way of folding napkins that meant, be strong, a particular humming pattern that said, I'm here with you, the way they arranged flowers that spelled out messages of hope and defiance that only they could read. Margaret noticed their growing closeness, but she misunderstood it. She saw it as weakness, as emotional dependence that she could exploit. She was wrong. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in February, the kind of cold, grey day when even the birds seemed too sad to sing. Margaret had been in a particularly foul mood all week, angry about some business dealings that hadn't gone her way, frustrated by a suitor who had shown more interest in her money than her charms. She was looking for someone to blame, someone to punish for disappointments that had nothing to do with them. She found her target in Temperance. The crime was minor, almost laughably small. A water glass left with the faintest smudge, barely visible unless you held it up to the light at just the right angle. Margaret noticed it during her afternoon tea, and her face transformed. The polite mask slipped away, revealing something hungry and cold underneath. What happened next would haunt Ruby and Celia for the rest of their lives, not because of its brutality, though it was brutal, but because of how calculated it was, how methodical. Margaret didn't lose her temper. She never raised her voice. She simply decided that Temperance needed to be reminded of her place, and she set about doing it with the precision of a clockmaker. Have you ever witnessed someone you love being destroyed piece by piece while you stood helpless to intervene? Ruby and Celia were forced to watch as Margaret systematically broke down everything that made Temperance who she was. Her dignity, her hope, her sense of self-worth. It took hours. By the end, the bright, laughing girl they loved was gone, replaced by something hollow and empty. That night, as they helped Temperance to her small room in the servants' quarters, something changed. The three women looked at each other and saw a truth that had been building for years, but had never been spoken aloud. Margaret Whitfield was going to destroy them, one by one, until nothing remained but broken shells serving a monster's whims. Unless they destroyed her first. The planning began that very night, whispered in the darkness while the rest of the plantation slept. They couldn't use poison. Margaret was too careful about her food, too suspicious of anything that came from their hands. They couldn't use a weapon. The sound would wake the house, and they would never escape. It had to be something else, something that would look like an accident, but would give them the satisfaction of watching their tormentors' final moments. Ruby remembered something from her childhood, a story her grandmother had told about a cruel overseer who had met his end in a creek during a thunderstorm. The official cause of death was drowning, but the old woman had winked when she told it, suggesting there was more to the story than anyone was willing to admit. "Water," Ruby whispered in the darkness. "She takes her baths every night at 9 o'clock sharp. The door locks from the inside, but there's a loose board near the window that we could remove. We could be waiting for her." Celia's voice was steady when she spoke. How do we explain being in her room? Temperance, still weak from her ordeal, but with fire returning to her eyes, provided the answer. "I'll tell her I need to prepare her bath, that there's something special I want to show her. Something to make amends for my clumsiness. She'll like that. She always likes it when she thinks she's broken us completely." The plan was simple, terrible, and perfect. In 3 days, when the moon was dark and the plantation was quiet, they would give Margaret Whitfield the bath of her life, her last bath. Can you imagine the weight of a decision that would change everything? The kind of choice that, once made, leaves no room for turning back. Ruby, Celia, and Temperance had crossed that line in the darkness of their quarters, but now, in the cold light of morning, the reality of what they were planning began to settle in their bones, like winter frost. Have you ever made a promise to someone you love that scared you to your very core? That's what these 3 women faced as they went about their daily duties, serving the woman they had sworn to kill. Every smile they forced, every curtsy they performed, every "Yes, Miss Margaret" they whispered, was now part of an elaborate performance. They were actresses playing the roles of obedient servants, while their hearts hammered with the rhythm of rebellion. The next morning brought its own horrors. Margaret, refreshed by her night's sleep, seemed to have developed an appetite for even more creative cruelties. She summoned Temperance to her room before dawn, ostensibly to discuss the girl's disappointing behavior from the previous day. What transpired behind those closed doors left Temperance walking differently, moving like someone whose spirit had been ground down even further. Ruby and Celia watched their sister return to the kitchen, and they saw something that made their blood run cold. Temperance's left hand was wrapped in a crude bandage, and when she tried to lift a pot with both hands, she winced in pain that she tried desperately to hide. What had Margaret done to her in those early morning hours? The answer came when Temperance finally showed them her injury in the privacy of the pantry. 3 fingers bore the distinct marks of having been held against something hot, not long enough to cause permanent damage, but long enough to serve as a reminder. Margaret had pressed Temperance's fingertips against the metal handle of a fireplace poker that had been resting near the coals. Can you imagine the self-control it must have taken for Ruby and Celia not to march straight to Margaret's room and end it all right there? But they knew that revenge without planning was just suicide with extra steps. They forced themselves to wait, to stick to their plan, even as they watched their beloved sister struggle to perform her duties with burned fingers. That afternoon, while Margaret entertained visitors on the veranda, the 3 women found themselves alone in the laundry room. Steam rose from the washing tubs like incense from an altar, and in that humid sanctuary, they refined their plan with the precision of generals preparing for war. Ruby had observed Margaret's evening routine countless times. The woman was a creature of rigid habit, believing that structure and control were the keys to maintaining power over her domain. Every night at exactly 9 o'clock, she would dismiss her servants and retire to her private chambers. She would spend precisely 15 minutes reading correspondence at her writing desk, then another 10 minutes brushing her hair while admiring herself in her vanity mirror. At 9:25, she would ring a small silver bell, and Temperance would appear to prepare her bath. The routine never varied. Margaret would soak for exactly 30 minutes in water heated to a specific temperature, scented with lavender oil imported from France. She would emerge at precisely 10 o'clock, wrap herself in Egyptian cotton towels, and spend another 15 minutes applying various creams and potions to her skin. But what if, on this particular night, the routine changed slightly? What if Margaret found herself with company in her bath? What if 3 women who had endured years of her torment decided that her nightly ritual of self-worship would become something else entirely? Celia had been studying the layout of Margaret's chambers with the intensity of an architect. The bathroom connected to the bedroom through a heavy wooden door that Margaret always locked from the inside. But there was another way in, a servant's entrance that had been sealed years ago but could be opened if you knew which boards to remove. Ruby's grandmother had shown her this secret passage when she was a child, back when the old woman still worked in the big house. Would you believe that some of the strongest bonds are forged in the planning of violence? As these three women worked out every detail of their plot, they grew closer than sisters, closer than blood. They were co-conspirators in the truest sense, bound together by a shared purpose that transcended everything else in their lives. The tools they would need were simple and readily available. A length of rope, supposedly for hanging laundry, but strong enough for other purposes. A wooden paddle used for stirring large pots of soap, heavy and wide enough to hold someone underwater. Most importantly, they would need their collective strength and the element of surprise. Think about this for a moment. These were women who had been trained from birth to be gentle, to serve, to submit. They had spent their entire lives using their hands to comfort, to clean, to create. Now they were planning to use those same hands to take a life. Can you imagine the internal struggle that must have caused? But love, real love, doesn't always look like kindness. Sometimes love looks like three women standing in a steamy laundry room, swearing an oath over washing tubs and dirty linens. Sometimes love looks like fury given form, like justice wearing the face of vengeance. The day of reckoning arrived with unseasonable warmth for March. Spring was trying to push through winter's grip, and the air carried the promise of new life, of fresh beginnings. How fitting that on such a day, three women would end one life to reclaim their own. Margaret seemed unusually cheerful that morning, which only made the servant's task more surreal. She hummed while she ate breakfast, complimented Ruby on the flower arrangements, and even gave Temperance a backhanded compliment about her improved posture. It was as if she sensed something different in the air, but interpreted it as her complete victory over these women's spirits. Have you ever noticed how predators often become careless when they believe their prey is completely broken? Margaret had made that mistake. She saw the quiet compliance of her servants as proof of her own power, never recognizing it as the calm before a storm. Throughout the day, the three women went about their duties with an almost supernatural focus. Every task was completed perfectly. Every interaction with Margaret was flawlessly respectful. They were saying goodbye to the women they had been, preparing to become something new, something harder, something capable of murder. As evening approached, you could feel the tension building in the house like pressure before a thunderstorm. The other servants seemed to sense it too, though they couldn't name what they were feeling. Conversations were quieter, movements more careful, as if everyone was walking on ground that might give way at any moment. Ruby checked and rechecked the servants' entrance to Margaret's chambers, ensuring the boards could be removed quickly and silently. Celia tested the rope, making sure it was strong enough for their purposes. Temperance, despite her injured fingers, practiced the words she would use to convince Margaret to let her prepare an extra special bath. Can you imagine the last meal a person eats before they commit murder? Margaret dined on roasted duck with cherry sauce, accompanied by wine that sparkled like liquid rubies in her crystal glasses. She ate with obvious pleasure, completely unaware that the women serving her were counting down the hours until her death. After dinner, Margaret retired to her parlour to read, as was her custom. She dismissed the servants with a wave of her hand, not bothering to look up from her book. Ruby, Celia, and Temperance curtsied and withdrew, but they didn't go far. They positioned themselves in the hallway, listening to the familiar sounds of Margaret's evening routine. The minutes crawled by like wounded animals. 9 o'clock came and went, 9:15, 9:20. At 9:23, they heard the silver bell ring, its clear tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Temperance smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and walked to Margaret's door. Her knock was perfectly normal, the same gentle rap she had used thousands of times before. "Come in," came Margaret's voice from within. As Temperance entered the room, Ruby and Celia made their way to the servants' entrance. The old boards came away easier than expected, as if the house itself wanted to help them in their task. They slipped inside like shadows, positioning themselves behind the heavy curtains that separated the bedroom from the bathing area. Through the fabric, they could hear Temperance's voice, sweet and deferential as always. "Miss Margaret, I've prepared something special for your bath tonight. A new mixture of oils that I heard about from one of the ladies who visited last week. She said it would make your skin even more beautiful than it already is." Margaret's laugh was like breaking glass. "How thoughtful of you, Temperance. I was beginning to think yesterday's lesson hadn't taken hold. Perhaps there's hope for you yet. The sound of water being poured, the clink of bottles, the rustle of fabric being removed. Normal sounds that tonight carried the weight of finality. Margaret was undressing, preparing for the last bath of her life. Would you be able to hide behind curtains, waiting to murder someone, listening to them laugh and chat as if nothing was about to happen? The psychological strain must have been enormous. But Ruby and Celia held their positions, knowing that Temperance was counting on them. "The water feels perfect," Margaret said, and they heard the splash as she settled into the tub. "You may go now, Temperance. I'll ring when I'm ready to get out." This was the moment. Temperance's voice remained steady as she said, "Actually, Miss Margaret, there's something else I wanted to show you. Something I've been working on as a surprise." "Oh? How intriguing. What is it?" Instead of answering with words, Temperance gave the signal they had agreed upon. She began to hum a specific tune, barely audible but clear enough for her sisters to hear. It was an old song their grandmother had taught them, about justice coming like water in the night. Ruby and Celia moved through the curtains like ghosts given form. Margaret, relaxing in her tub with her eyes closed, didn't sense their presence until it was too late. When she finally opened her eyes and saw 3 figures surrounding her bath, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion, then recognition, then the dawning realization that her perfectly ordered world was about to collapse. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, but her voice lacked its usual authority. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitfield was not in control, and she knew it. Ruby spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of decades of suffering. "Miss Margaret, is that some? The meaning, debts come due when you least expect them. Can you imagine the exact moment when someone realizes their life is about to end? That split second when the world shifts from familiar to terrifying, when the person who has held all the power suddenly becomes powerless." Margaret Whitfield experienced that moment as she stared up at 3 faces she had tormented for years. 3 women who were no longer her servants but her judges. Would you believe that in that instant, Margaret tried to maintain her authority? Even naked and vulnerable in a tub of water, she attempted to assert control. "Get out of my chambers immediately," she hissed, her voice shaking despite her efforts to sound commanding. "I'll have you all whipped for this intrusion." But Ruby stepped closer to the edge of the tub, and something in her eyes made Margaret's words die in her throat. This wasn't the same woman who had arranged flowers with trembling hands after being humiliated in front of guests. This was someone transformed, someone who had finally found her voice after years of forced silence. "Miss Margaret," Ruby said, her tone conversational, almost gentle. "Do you remember what you told me last Christmas when I dropped that crystal ornament? You said that clumsy hands deserve clumsy treatment. You made me pick up every shard with my bare fingers while you watched." Celia moved to the other side of the tub, her presence like a storm cloud gathering strength. "And do you remember," she continued Ruby's thought, "when you described how children are sold at market? How you wondered aloud whether my babies cried themselves to sleep thinking about their mama?" Temperance remained by the door, but her voice carried clearly across the room. "She remembers," she said quietly. "She remembers every cruel word, every calculated hurt. The question is, does she remember why we're here?" Can you imagine being in Margaret's position, suddenly understanding that years of cruelty were about to be repaid in full? Her face had gone pale as porcelain, and for the first time since childhood, Margaret Whitfield was genuinely afraid. The water that had seemed so warm and inviting moments before now felt like it was growing colder, deeper, more dangerous. "What do you want?" Margaret whispered, and the question hung in the air like incense in a church. What did they want? Justice? Revenge? Or simply the satisfaction of watching their tormentor experience the helplessness they had felt for so long? Ruby reached into her apron and withdrew the length of rope they had prepared. The sight of it made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. "We want you to understand something that you never learned, Miss Margaret. We want you to know what it feels like to be completely at someone else's mercy. Would you be able to remain calm if you were staring at your own death?" Margaret tried to rise from the tub, water sloshing over the sides, but Celia's hand pressed firmly on her shoulder, pushing her back down. The touch was almost gentle, But the message was clear. There would be no escape. "Please," Margaret said, and the words seemed foreign in her mouth. How long had it been since she had begged for anything? "Please, I can change. I can be better to you. I can give you your freedom." Temperance laughed. But it wasn't a sound of joy. It was the bitter laugh of someone who had heard too many empty promises. "Our freedom? You think you have the right to give us what was never yours to take?" Think about this for a moment. These three women had spent their entire adult lives serving someone who viewed them as property, as things to be used and discarded at will. Now, suddenly, Margaret was offering them freedom as if it were hers to grant. Can you understand why such an offer would feel like just another insult? Ruby began wrapping one end of the rope around her hand, testing its strength. "Miss Margaret, do you know what my grandmother told me about water? She said it's patient. It doesn't hurry. It just keeps flowing until it finds its way through every crack, until it wears down even the hardest stone." The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Margaret's eyes darted between the three women, looking for any sign of mercy, any crack in their resolve. She found none. These weren't the broken servants she thought she knew. These were women who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and had emerged as something harder, something implacable. Celia picked up the wooden paddle they had brought, the one used for stirring soap in the laundry. In the candlelight, it looked like an instrument of judgment. "You know what's interesting about drowning?" she said conversationally. "It's not always fast. Sometimes a person can struggle for quite a while before the water wins." Can you imagine the terror Margaret must have felt hearing those words? This wasn't going to be a quick death. This was going to be a lesson, a demonstration of everything she had put them through over the years. They were going to make her experience every moment of helplessness, every second of despair that they had endured. "Wait," Margaret said desperately. "There's money, jewelry. I can make you rich. You could buy your own freedom, start your own lives somewhere far from here." Temperance shook her head slowly. "You still don't understand, do you? This isn't about money or freedom or starting over. This is about finishing what you started. This is about making sure you can never hurt anyone else the way you've hurt us. Think about your own family, your own love, breaking their spirits years, someone entering the more systematically TD ones. If had spent piece by piece, would money be enough? Would promises of future kindness erase years of past cruelty? These three women had moved beyond the possibility of forgiveness. They had entered a space where only justice remained. Ruby nodded to her sisters, and they moved with the coordination of dancers who had rehearsed their steps countless times. Celia positioned herself at the head of the tub, paddle ready. Temperance moved to secure the door, ensuring they wouldn't be interrupted. Ruby began fashioning a loop in the rope, with movements that were surprisingly steady for someone about to commit murder. "This is your last chance to understand something, Miss Margaret," Ruby said as she worked. "We're not doing this because we're animals or because we're savage. We're doing this because we're human beings who have been pushed beyond human endurance. We're doing this because love sometimes looks like justice, and justice sometimes requires terrible things." Would you believe that Margaret, even in her final moments, couldn't grasp what they were trying to tell her? She kept offering them material things, as if money or property could somehow balance the scales of what she had done. She couldn't comprehend that what they wanted wasn't wealth or status or even freedom. What they wanted was for her to understand, truly understand, what she had put them through. Can you imagine the sound of water moving in a confined space? The splash and echo as someone struggles against forces stronger than themselves. The bathroom at Magnolia Grove had excellent acoustics, designed so that Margaret could hear every word of conversation in her bedroom while she bathed. Now those same acoustics amplified different sounds. The sound of justice being served by hands that had known only gentleness until they were forced to learn violence. Ruby held one end of the rope while Celia secured Margaret's hands behind her back. It wasn't tight enough to cut off circulation, but it was firm enough to prevent any chance of escape. Temperance kept watch at the door, listening for any sounds that might indicate they had been discovered. "Do you know what we talked about in the quarters at night?" Celia asked as she adjusted the rope. "We talked about you. About how someone could become so empty inside that they needed to fill themselves up with other people's pain. We wondered if you had ever been a child, if you had ever laughed without cruelty behind it." Margaret was crying now, tears mixing with the bathwater as she realized that no amount of pleading would change what was about to happen. "I was a child once," she whispered. "I had dreams. I wanted to be loved." Temperance paused in her watchkeeping and looked back at their tormentor. "So did we," she said simply. "So did every person you ever hurt. But wanting to be loved doesn't give you the right to destroy others. Think about the cycles of cruelty that pass from one generation to the next." Margaret had been shaped by her own upbringing, molded by a system that taught her to view other human beings as property. But that understanding, that context, didn't erase the pain she had caused. It didn't make her victim's suffering any less real. Ruby tested the rope one final time, then looked at her sisters. They nodded, almost imperceptibly. This was the moment they had planned for, the moment when years of accumulated pain would finally find its release. "Miss Margaret," Ruby said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "we want you to know something. In another life, under different circumstances, we might have been friends. We might have laughed together, shared secrets, cared for each other. But you chose a different path. You chose to make us your enemies." The water in the tub began to churn as Margaret realized that her time had run out. Can you imagine the thoughts that must have raced through her mind in those final moments? Did she think about her childhood, her dreams, the choices that had led her to this bathroom on this terrible night? Celia raised the wooden paddle, and Margaret saw her own reflection in the dark water, distorted and wavering like a ghost already departing from the world. "This is for every night we cried ourselves to sleep," Celia said. "This is for every scar you left on our hearts." The first push came without warning, sudden and decisive. Margaret's head went under the water, and the sound she made was like a wounded animal calling out for help that would never come. But Ruby and Celia were strong from years of hard labor, and Temperance had moved from the door to help hold their victim down. Would you believe that even in those final moments, Margaret fought with the desperate strength of someone who had never truly faced consequences for her actions? The water splashed violently, soaking the women's dresses, turning the peaceful bathroom into a scene of struggle and retribution. "Stop fighting," Temperance whispered, her burned fingers holding firm despite the pain. "Accept what's coming. Accept what you earned." Can you imagine the strange intimacy of that moment? These three women, who had spent years being invisible to their mistress, were now the only witnesses to her final moments. They were the last faces she would ever see, the last voices she would ever hear. The struggles grew weaker, more desperate. Margaret's eyes, wide with terror above the waterline, seemed to finally understand what Ruby had meant about justice looking like terrible things. This wasn't random violence or mindless revenge. This was a reckoning as inevitable as sunrise, as necessary as rain after a long drought. Think about the moment when someone stops fighting, when resistance gives way to acceptance. Margaret's body went still beneath the water, and the three women holding her down felt something shift in the air around. A circled them. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was completion that had been broken was finally closing. Ruby kept her grip on the rope for several minutes longer, making sure there would be no last-minute revival, no gasping return to consciousness. When she finally let go, Margaret's body floated motionless in the tub, her pale skin looking almost translucent in the candlelight. The silence that followed was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Not the oppressive quiet of fear that had governed their lives for so long, but something deeper, something final. The three women stood around the tub, breathing hard, their dresses soaked with water and the weight of what they had just done. Can you imagine that moment when everything you've ever known about yourself changes forever? When you cross a line so absolute that there's no going back to who you were before? Ruby, Celia, and Temperance were no longer servants. They were no longer victims. They had become something else entirely, something the world had no name for. Temperance was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is she really gone?" The question hung in the steamy air like incense, heavy with disbelief and something that might have been wonder. Ruby reached down and pressed her fingers to Margaret's neck, feeling for any sign of life. Nothing. The woman who had terrorized them for years, who had held their very existence in her pale hands like a toy she could break at will, was finally, truly powerless. "She's gone," Ruby confirmed, and the words tasted strange in her mouth. Foreign, like speaking a language she'd never learned. Would you believe that their first emotion wasn't relief or satisfaction? It was confusion. For years, Margaret Whitfield had been the center of their universe, the force around which every moment of their lives revolved. Without her cruelty to define them, without her demands to shape their days, who were they supposed to be? They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes the real stories live in whispered secrets, in memories passed down through generations who refuse to forget. Ruby, Celia, and Temperance vanished that night, disappearing into the Louisiana bayou like ghosts returning to the mist. The official report called Margaret's death a tragic accident, a woman who slipped in her bath and drowned alone. But you and I know better, don't we? We know that love doesn't always wear the face of kindness. Sometimes it wears the face of justice. Sometimes it holds people underwater until the bubbles stop rising. Can you imagine if this happened to your family? If someone you loved was pushed so far beyond breaking that they became capable of the impossible? These three women proved that even the quietest voices can roar when they finally find their strength. They showed us that some debts can only be paid in full, and that sisterhood forged in suffering burns hotter than any flame. If this story stirred something deep in your soul, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear these forgotten truths. Because stories like these, stories of love that looks like vengeance and justice, served by trembling hands, these are the stories that refuse to stay buried. Just like Ruby, Celia, and Temperance, some names are too powerful to drown.